They were 72 and 70 years old, and they had nothing left. No home, no retirement savings, no place waiting for them, just 3 worn suitcases, a loyal 11-year-old German shepherd named Shadow, and the last $10 Thomas Walker kept folded inside his wallet. On a bright spring morning in the quiet town of Bellows Falls, Vermont, they spent that final $10 bill to buy an abandoned clockmaker's shop that had stood silent for more than 55 years. The roof leaked, the windows were boarded shut, the master clock had not ticked since 1969. Everyone believed the old shop was beyond saving, but what no one knew was that hidden behind the great clock's mainspring case, in a secret compartment untouched for decades, waited a final gift from the last clockmaker, a gift meant only for the person who truly understood that time is measured not by clocks, but by love. Before we continue, if stories like this mean something to you, be sure to subscribe and tell us in the comments where you're watching from. We love seeing how far these stories travel. A soft spring sun drifted over Burlington, Vermont, filling the quiet neighborhood with clean golden light, while a cool breeze carried the scent of budding maple trees and damp earth. The morning was beautiful enough to make heartbreak seem almost impossible. Thomas Walker stood on the front porch of the small white house where he had lived for 43 years. At 72, he remained remarkably tall, just over 6 feet, with a lean frame shaped by decades of careful work rather than heavy labor. His neatly trimmed silver-gray hair caught the morning light, while his short beard framed a weathered face marked by deep lines earned through patience instead of anger. His blue-gray eyes still possessed the steady concentration of a master clockmaker, though grief had softened them. His broad hands, rough with countless tiny scars from spring's gears and brass edges, rested quietly around the worn handle of an old leather suitcase. He rarely complained, even during the hardest years. Friends had often said Thomas could fix almost anything except his own heart. Behind him, the front door stood open for the last time. Helen Walker stepped outside carrying another faded suitcase. At 70, she moved with gentle grace despite the exhaustion that weighed on her shoulders. She was much shorter than Thomas, her silver-white hair falling softly to her shoulders in loose waves. Her light blue eyes had always been the first thing her elementary school students remembered, kind enough to calm frightened children on their first day of class. Time had etched delicate wrinkles across her face, yet her warm smile remained unchanged, even if it appeared only rarely these days. She wore her familiar cream cardigan over a pale blue blouse, beige slacks, and comfortable brown walking shoes. Throughout 48 years of marriage, she had become the quiet strength behind Thomas's calm determination. Whenever he lost hope, she quietly replaced it before he even realized it had disappeared. Neither of them looked back inside the house immediately. Every room carried a memory they could no longer afford. The dining table where birthdays had been celebrated, the kitchen where Helen had baked cinnamon bread every Sunday morning, the workshop in the garage where Thomas had restored hundreds of antique clocks for neighbors across Vermont. Almost everything had been sold: the antique furniture, the pickup truck, Helen's piano, Thomas's personal collection of rare pocket watches, their retirement savings, their investments, even the wedding china. Piece by piece, they had willingly traded away nearly everything to keep their only daughter alive during years of expensive cancer treatments. She had survived, something Thomas and Helen would choose again every single time. Yet survival had come with another cost. Medical debt, refinancing, and finally foreclosure had taken away the house they had built their entire married life around. Thomas slipped a folded $10 bill from his wallet for a brief moment before placing it back carefully. It was the last cash they owned. "Still there?" Helen asked gently. Thomas smiled without humor. Our final fortune?" She reached over and squeezed his hand. "It brought us hope once. Maybe it still can." Before Thomas could answer, a large German shepherd bounded across the yard. Shadow was 11 years old enough for silver hairs to spread across his black muzzle, yet his powerful frame remained impressive. His thick, black and tan coat gleamed beneath the spring sunshine, while intelligent amber eyes constantly searched Thomas's face for reassurance. Years earlier, Thomas had rescued him from an overcrowded animal shelter after Shadow had been abandoned by his previous owner. From that day forward, the dog had rarely been more than a few feet away from either Thomas or Helen. Gentle with children, endlessly patient with strangers, and fiercely protective whenever danger approached, Shadow had somehow become the emotional center of their family. Thomas clipped the worn leather leash onto Shadow's collar. "Ready, old friend?" Instead of following, Shadow pulled away. The dog trotted back toward the porch. He stopped, sat down, and stared directly at the front door. His ears stood perfectly upright. He refused to move. Thomas tried again. "Come on, boy." Nothing. Shadow remained frozen. Helen walked over, kneeling despite the ache in her knees. She wrapped both arms around the aging shepherd. "It's all right," she whispered, tears finally escaping. "I don't want to leave either." Shadow rested his heavy head against her shoulder without making a sound. For nearly 2 minutes, none of them moved. Thomas watched the scene quietly. He realized Shadow understood more than either of them wanted to admit. Dogs never cared about mortgages, or banks, or debt. To Shadow, this porch simply meant home. Thomas swallowed the lump in his throat and stepped beside Helen. He gently rested one hand on her shoulder. "We're losing a house," he said softly. "Not each other." Helen looked into his eyes. "And wherever you are?" "But that's home," Thomas finished. She smiled through her tears. Shadow finally stood. Without another command, he walked beside Thomas as though accepting that home was no longer a place behind them. It was the two people beside him. They loaded their 3 worn suitcases into a small, second-hand luggage cart that Thomas pulled by hand. No destination had been planned beyond finding work somewhere. By noon, they reached a roadside picnic area overlooking the Connecticut River. The air smelled of fresh pine and flowing water. Helen divided the last 2 sandwiches into 3 portions. Thomas noticed she had secretly made her own piece smaller. He quietly exchanged theirs while pretending to refill his water bottle. She noticed. Neither of them mentioned it. Shadow happily accepted the larger portion placed in front of him, wagging his tail with the innocent gratitude only a dog could possess. For a few peaceful minutes, the world almost felt normal again. As Thomas folded the paper wrapping, voices drifted from the nearby picnic table. 2 elderly men sat beneath a maple tree drinking coffee from metal thermoses. One wore faded denim overalls beneath an old plaid shirt, while the other leaned heavily on a carved wooden cane. Their weathered faces suggested decades of farming and hard New England winters. "Well, we're still sitting there," one man said. "Nobody wants the old Clockmaker's shop." "The one in Bellows Falls?" "That's right." "The Elijah Brooks place?" "The very one." "I heard the town's willing to let it go for $10. Thomas's hands froze. The second man chuckled. $10 won't fix a roof that's been leaking since Nixon was president." "No," the first replied. "They're not selling a building." He lowered his voice. "They're looking for someone willing to bring it back to life." Thomas slowly looked toward Helen. She had heard every word. Neither of them spoke. Neither of them smiled. But for the first time since sunrise, hope entered the silence between them. And somehow, without anyone calling him, Shadow stood, ears raised toward the distant road leading to Bellows Falls, staring as though he already knew exactly where they were supposed to go. The following morning arrived with another clear Vermont sky, sunlight spilling gently across the Connecticut River, as if the world had decided to begin again. Thomas Walker tightened the collar of his faded brown canvas jacket, while Helen adjusted the strap of the small canvas bag that now carried nearly everything they owned. Shadow walked quietly between them, his ears alert and his amber eyes studying every unfamiliar street as they entered Bellows Falls. The town was smaller than Thomas had imagined. Brick storefronts stood beside weathered wooden buildings, their history written into every faded sign and cracked sidewalk. Unlike larger cities that constantly replaced the old with the new, Bellows Falls seemed content to remember. The town office occupied a modest 19th-century brick building overlooking a small public square. Inside, polished wooden floors creaked beneath every step, and framed black-and-white photographs of generations long gone lined the hallway. Behind a heavy oak counter sat Margaret Buckley, the town clerk. Margaret was 68 years old, a woman of average height, with neatly pinned silver hair and warm hazel eyes hidden behind thin reading glasses. Years of helping neighbors with births, deaths, deeds, and marriages had given her an uncommon patience. Her voice carried the calm confidence of someone who had quietly solved other people's problems for decades without asking for recognition. She noticed immediately that Thomas and Helen looked exhausted long before either of them spoke. "Good morning," she said gently. Thomas removed his worn cap. "We heard there's an old clockmaker's shop for sale." Margaret studied him for several seconds. "Most people ask how much land comes with it." Thomas smiled faintly. "I'm more interested in what's still standing." Something softened in her expression. Without another word, she disappeared into a back office before returning with a weathered leather folder nearly 2 inches thick. She placed it carefully on the counter. "This," she said, "is the Elijah Brooks Clockmaker's shop." She opened the file. Inside were faded photographs. One showed a handsome wooden storefront bustling with customers sometime during the 1950s. Another displayed an elderly craftsman adjusting a massive grandfather clock. A third revealed the same building boarded shut after its final day of business in November 1969. Elijah Brooks was the last independent master clockmaker in this county, Margaret explained. When battery-powered clocks became common, fewer people repaired old mechanical ones. Eventually, business disappeared. Helen looked at the photographs. "He simply closed?" Margaret nodded. "He locked the front door himself and never came back." Thomas remained silent. He understood that kind of ending. Margaret continued. "For decades, the building changed ownership through tax foreclosure. Every buyer wanted to tear it down." She paused before adding quietly, "The Historical Preservation Committee refused every demolition request." She slid another document toward Thomas. "The council voted 5 years ago that if anyone truly wished to restore the building and preserve the trade, they could purchase it for $10. Thomas read every line carefully. The conditions were straightforward. The exterior must remain historically intact. The workshop could not become a restaurant or retail chain. Its heritage as a clockmaker's shop had to be honored. Helen looked toward Thomas. "What do you think?" he answered without lifting his eyes. "I think some buildings deserve one more chance." Margaret smiled for the first time. "So do I." Thomas carefully unfolded the last $10 bill from his wallet. The paper had become soft from years of folding. He placed it gently on the counter. Margaret accepted it almost ceremonially before unlocking an old wooden cabinet behind her desk. From inside, She removed a surprisingly heavy brass key attached to a cracked leather fob, darkened by age. She rested it in Thomas's palm. This is the original key. It has waited here since November 11th, 1969. Thomas stared at it silently. So it's been waiting longer than I have. Margaret chuckled softly. Maybe? Or maybe it's been waiting specifically for you. Half an hour later, they stood in front of the building. The Elijah Brooks Clockmaker's shop looked even older than the photographs suggested. Its white clapboard siding had faded almost grey. Several cedar shingles had slipped from the roof. The front display windows were hidden behind weathered wooden boards. A crooked wooden sign still hung above the entrance, its faded carved letters barely readable beneath decades of peeling paint. Elijah Brooks Clockmaker. Helen reached for Thomas's hand. It still feels alive, he nodded. It does. Thomas inserted the brass key. The lock resisted for only a moment. Then came a deep, metallic click. The door slowly opened inward. Dust floated through long beams of sunlight like tiny stars suspended in the air. The smell of aged wood, machine oil, old paper, and forgotten years filled the room. No one spoke. Shadow entered first. His large paws echoed softly across the worn pine floorboards. Instead of exploring wildly, he moved slowly through the workshop as though instinctively respecting the silence. Shelves lined both walls. Hundreds of tiny drawers still carried handwritten labels, escapements, springs, balance staffs, hands, jewels. Most remained unopened since 1969. Near the front window stood a long oak workbench covered beneath decades of dust. Thomas gently brushed away the grey layer with one sleeve. The polished wood beneath remained beautiful. Someone had loved this bench. Near the rear wall stood the heart of the shop. A towering mahogany master regulator clock stretched almost to the ceiling. Its brass pendulum hung perfectly still behind thick glass. Its white enamel dial displayed elegant Roman numerals. The hands had stopped forever at 4:47. Thomas instinctively stepped closer. Without touching anything, he listened. Silence. Not ordinary silence. The absence of something that belonged. He frowned slightly. That's strange. Helen looked over. What is? I should hear tension inside. There isn't any. Shadow approached the great clock. He sniffed once, then lay directly beside its base. He refused to move, almost as though he had found the place he intended to guard. Outside, afternoon sunlight slowly crossed the dusty windows. Inside, Thomas and Helen unpacked their 3 suitcases. One held clothing, one contained blankets. The third held Thomas's watchmaker's loop, a handful of carefully wrapped repair tools, and one framed wedding photograph. Helen placed the photograph on the workbench. Thomas carefully set his loop beside it. It isn't much. Helen smiled. It feels like home already. That evening, they spread 2 old coats across the wooden floor beneath the master clock. The roof leaked gently in one corner after a brief spring shower. Wind whispered through tiny cracks around the windows. Thomas pretended to be asleep. When Helen quietly covered him with a thicker blanket because of his aching back, he waited until her breathing slowed before gently placing his own coat over her shoulders. Shadow curled tightly between them, his warm body pressing against both owners. For the first time in months, neither Thomas nor Helen fell asleep worrying about what they had lost. Instead, they wondered what this old building might still be hiding. Above them, the motionless master clock stood in complete silence. Yet somehow, Thomas could not shake the feeling that something inside it was still waiting. Morning arrived quietly over Bellows Falls, and warm sunlight slipped through the dusty front windows of the old clockmaker's shop, turning thousands of floating dust particles into tiny flecks of gold. Outside, the town slowly awakened, but inside the workshop, time still refused to move. Thomas Walker had barely slept. Long before Helen opened her eyes, he was already standing before the towering mahogany master regulator clock. Its polished wooden case still possessed remarkable dignity despite decades of neglect. The white enamel dial remained frozen at 4:47, and the heavy brass pendulum hung perfectly motionless behind the glass door. Thomas crossed his arms and listened again. Nothing. Not a single whisper of tension. For a man who had spent nearly 50 years repairing mechanical clocks, silence itself could become a language. Helen soon joined him, carrying 2 steaming cups of coffee she had brewed on a small camping stove near the back door. The gentle aroma drifted through the workshop, softening the smell of old wood and machine oil. "You've been standing here a long time," she said. Thomas nodded. "I keep hearing what isn't there." Helen smiled gently. "Only you would say something like that." Thomas rested one weathered hand against the side of the case. "A clock this large should always feel alive, even when it isn't running." Shadow wandered over, his claws clicking softly across the wooden floor. The aging German shepherd sniffed around the base of the clock once more. Unlike the day before, however, he became unusually focused. His ears lifted, his tail stopped moving. Then he began scratching, not wildly, deliberately, 3 slow scrapes against the lower wooden panel. Thomas frowned. "Easy, boy." Shadow stepped back, then scratched again. Exactly the same place. Helen looked down. "He's trying to show you something." Thomas knelt despite the stiffness in his knees. The wood beneath Shadow's paws looked almost identical to the surrounding panels, but years of repairing antique furniture had trained Thomas to notice details most people overlooked. The grain didn't match perfectly, neither did the finish. Someone had replaced this section long ago. He carefully brushed away layers of dust. 6 small brass screws appeared beneath the grime. "They're newer than the rest," Thomas whispered. He hurried to unpack the leather tool roll that had followed him through every move of his adult life. Inside lay screwdrivers polished smooth by decades of use. They had once belonged to his father, Samuel Walker, a quiet watchmaker whose enormous hands somehow possessed the gentleness required to repair movements smaller than a silver dollar. Samuel had believed patience was something children learned by watching, not by being told. Thomas suddenly found himself remembering afternoons spent beside his father's workbench, where silence had always meant concentration rather than loneliness. He selected the correct screwdriver. One by one, the screws loosened. The panel resisted for only a moment before lifting free. Behind it stretched a narrow, hidden compartment between the clock case and the rear wall. Inside rested 3 objects: a tightly wrapped canvas pouch, a polished brass mainspring barrel, and a sealed envelope. No one spoke. Thomas carefully lifted the envelope first. Across the front, written in elegant fountain pen ink, faded slightly brown with age, were only 7 words: "For the clockmaker who comes after me." Thomas opened it with almost ceremonial care. The letter inside was remarkably well preserved. "My name is Elijah Brooks. If you are reading this, then you have done something few people ever bothered to do. You listened. Most people look at a silent clock and see furniture. A clockmaker hears absence. I closed this shop on November 11th, 1969, not because I stopped loving my work, but because the world stopped believing mechanical time was worth repairing. Before I locked the door, I removed the mainspring from my regulator. Without its mainspring, this clock cannot live. That is intentional. Only someone who understands that the mainspring is the heart of every clock deserves to awaken it again. The canvas pouch contains every gold coin I saved during 35 years at this bench. I trusted my own walls more than any bank. Spend the money wisely. Do not spend it quickly. Restore this shop before you restore your comfort. If this room ever hears steady ticking again, then my life's work will not have ended. It will simply have changed hands. Thomas lowered the letter slowly. His eyes had become wet, not because of the gold, because someone he had never met understood him completely. Helen reached for his hand. "I think he was waiting for you." Thomas shook his head softly. "No. He was waiting for someone." Shadow quietly rested his grey muzzle against Thomas's knee. Thomas smiled and scratched behind the old dog's ears. "You found it." The canvas pouch felt surprisingly heavy. Inside lay row after row of gleaming gold coins wrapped individually in faded cloth. Even beneath decades of darkness, each coin reflected warm sunlight. Helen counted carefully. 41. Neither of them had ever held so much gold. Beside the pouch lay another wooden box that Thomas had overlooked. Inside rested precision tools unlike anything he had seen before. Tiny brass calipers, custom-made escapement files, polished burnishers, handmade tweezers. Several carried Elijah Brooks's initials delicately engraved into the handles. Thomas lifted one file. "It still feels balanced." Helen laughed softly. "You sound like someone admiring a violin." "I am." He carefully returned every tool to its place. "We're not selling these." "No," Helen agreed immediately. "They belong here." Thomas folded Elijah's letter with equal care before placing it inside his jacket pocket. "I'll frame it someday." The room felt different now, not richer, warmer, as though someone invisible had quietly welcomed them. Thomas picked up the brass mainspring barrel. It remained perfectly sealed. He held it beside his ear. Silence. Yet this time he smiled. "It isn't broken." Helen looked puzzled. "How can you tell?" "Because it isn't supposed to make a sound." He gently set it on the workbench. "When we place this back where it belongs," he looked toward the motionless master clock towering over them, "time will begin again." Shadow suddenly stood and wagged his tail toward the silent regulator. For the first time since entering the shop, Thomas no longer saw an abandoned building. He saw a promise waiting to be fulfilled. The first weeks of early summer settled gently over Bellows Falls, filling the streets with warm sunshine, bright blue skies, and the sweet fragrance of blooming lilacs. Every morning, the old clockmaker's shop welcomed another day of light, though inside its greatest clock still stood silent, waiting for the hands of someone who believed time deserved another chance. Thomas folded Elijah Brooks's letter one last time before placing it inside a simple wooden picture frame he found in one of the workshop drawers. He set it carefully on the oak workbench where he could see it every day. "It belongs where work is done," he said quietly. Helen smiled. "So does hope." Neither of them mentioned the gold immediately. Instead, they walked together to the small community bank on Main Street, carrying only 8 of the 41 coins wrapped inside a canvas pouch. The bank manager, Richard Nolan, was a man in his early 60s with broad shoulders, neatly combed grey hair, and a clean-shaven face that carried the calm confidence of someone who had spent 40 years earning the trust of an entire town. He examined the coins carefully without showing excitement. "You've inherited quite a remarkable collection," he said. Thomas simply nodded. "We're selling only what we need." Richard looked at him for a moment before replying. "That's usually how people keep blessings." A week later, after the coins had been authenticated by a regional numismatic dealer, the proceeds were deposited into a savings account. Thomas refused to touch most of the money. "Elijah spent 35 years saving this," he told Helen. "We'll spend 35 years honoring it." The first purchases were modest. A used 2006 Chevrolet Colorado pickup with more than 160,000 miles but a dependable engine. Replacement glass for the broken front windows, basic plumbing supplies, roofing shingles, fresh paint, a second-hand mattress, nothing more. Every dollar had a purpose. Word traveled quickly through Bellows Falls that someone had finally reopened the Elijah Brooks shop. Small towns carried news the way rivers carried leaves, slowly, naturally, and impossible to stop. One Saturday morning, an elderly carpenter named Walter Briggs appeared without warning. Walter was 76, nearly as old as Thomas, with powerful shoulders. That age had failed to bend completely. His thick white moustache covered most of his smile, and years of working with timber had left his hands almost as rough as Thomas's. After losing his wife several winters earlier, Walter had thrown himself into repairing neighbors' porches simply to keep loneliness from settling too deeply into his life. He removed his cap. "Heard somebody finally moved into Elijah's place." Thomas nodded. "I did." Walter looked toward the sagging porch roof. "Looks like she needs a little kindness." Without discussing payment, he unloaded ladders and tools from his truck. By sunset, the front porch stood level again. When Thomas tried to offer money, Walter laughed. "You'll insult an old carpenter if you pay him before sharing a cup of coffee." Helen brewed fresh coffee. They talked until evening. Before leaving, Walter scratched Shadow gently behind the ears. "Best foreman you've got." Shadow wagged his tail proudly. A few days later, Reverend Daniel Moore stopped by carrying 2 grocery boxes. Daniel was 64, tall and slender with gentle brown eyes, thinning silver hair, and a soft voice that rarely rose above conversation. Years spent comforting grieving families had taught him that people often needed practical help before they needed prayers. He placed canned food, bread, vegetables, and homemade preserves on the workbench. "Our church takes care of neighbors." Thomas hesitated. "We don't want charity." Daniel smiled kindly. "Neither do I. This isn't charity, it's community." After lunch, Margaret Buckley arrived in her aging station wagon. The back was filled with kitchen supplies, pots, pans, blankets, old gardening tools, even several books about restoring historic New England buildings. "My late husband collected these," she explained. "He'd be pleased someone finally needs them." Helen hugged her without speaking. Little by little, the empty building began looking less abandoned. Helen planted white daisies and blue lupines beneath the front windows. She washed decades of dust from every shelf. She stitched simple curtains from inexpensive cotton fabric. She insisted the workshop deserved flowers. Thomas insisted flowers belonged in gardens. By the following week, he admitted they belonged in both places. Meanwhile, Thomas devoted every daylight hour to the master regulator. Each brass gear was removed individually, every pivot polished, every bearing cleaned with patient hands. The new mainspring remained wrapped beside him until every other component was ready. Several times he stopped simply to listen. Mechanical clocks rewarded patience. They punished hurry. One quiet morning, Helen noticed Thomas staring silently at the movement. "Something wrong?" He smiled. "No." "I'm just introducing myself," she laughed. "To the clock? To Elijah?" On the first clear morning of June, sunlight poured through the restored front windows, filling the workshop with golden light. Thomas lifted the polished mainspring barrel. His hands moved with slow confidence. The springs slid perfectly into place, the retaining click engaged, every gear aligned, every screw tightened. He stepped back. For a long moment, no one breathed. Helen stood beside Shadow, near the doorway. Thomas reached for the winding key. One turn, then another, then another. The great spring accepted its stored energy. He gently pushed the brass pendulum. It swung left, right, left again. The escapement hesitated. Thomas closed his eyes, listening. One tiny adjustment, barely a quarter turn. He released the pendulum once more. Tick, silence. Tick, tick, tick. The sound spread slowly through the workshop like the first drops of rain after a long drought. Steady, balanced, certain. The great clock had awakened. Thomas remained perfectly still. His eyes filled with tears, not because he had repaired a machine, because he had fulfilled another man's final wish. Helen covered her mouth as emotion overwhelmed her. She crossed the room and wrapped both arms around Thomas. For several seconds, neither of them spoke. Shadow suddenly barked once, then twice, then raced joyful circles around the workshop, tail wagging wildly as though celebrating with every ounce of strength his aging body still possessed. Even Walter, who happened to be replacing one final porch railing outside, stopped working. He removed his cap as the sound reached the front porch. "I never thought I'd hear that old clock again," he whispered. Inside the shop, the steady ticking continued without hesitation. 55 years of silence had finally come to an end. Thomas looked up at the great mahogany case, then quietly touched the framed letter resting beside his tools. "Welcome home, Elijah," he said, and the master regulator answered only the way a faithful clock ever could. Tick, tick, tick. Summer settled comfortably over Bellows Falls, and each bright morning began with the steady heartbeat of the master regulator clock echoing through the restored workshop. Its calm, even ticking drifted out the open front door and into the street, becoming a sound many long-time residents had never expected to hear again. Margaret Buckley could not resist taking a photograph. Standing across the street one clear Saturday morning, she captured the sunlight reflecting from the freshly cleaned display windows, while Thomas adjusted an old mantel clock inside and Helen watered the flower boxes beneath the porch. Shadow sat proudly by the doorway like an aging guardian. That evening, she posted the picture on the Bellows Falls community page with only one sentence. "The old Elijah Brooks Clockmaker's shop is alive again." By Monday morning, nearly everyone in town had seen it. 3 days later, a small article appeared in the Bellows Falls Gazette beneath the headline, "The Last Clockmaker Returns." Thomas laughed quietly when Helen showed him the newspaper. "I'm not the last," she smiled. "Then let's make sure you're not." The article travelled farther than either of them expected. People from neighbouring towns began arriving one by one. Some carried clocks wrapped carefully in blankets. Others arrived holding worn pocket watches inside velvet boxes that had not been opened in decades. Every visitor carried more than a broken timepiece. They carried a memory. The first customer was Eleanor Pierce. Eleanor was 79 years old, tall and slender despite her age, with neatly curled white hair and bright green eyes that still held traces of youthful determination. Her late husband had served as a railroad engineer for almost 40 years, and after losing him 6 years earlier, she had lived quietly alone in the farmhouse they had built together. She rarely spoke to strangers, but when she entered the shop, carrying an old walnut mantel clock against her chest, her careful hands revealed how deeply she treasured it. "My husband wound this every Sunday morning," she said softly. "It stopped the week after he died." Thomas accepted the clock with both hands. "I'll take good care of it." Helen invited Eleanor to sit near the front window. Fresh tea was already waiting. They talked for nearly an hour, not about clocks, about marriage, gardens, children, the sound of trains that no longer passed through town. Thomas listened while carefully removing the movement from the wooden case. By the time Eleanor finished telling stories about her husband, Thomas had already discovered the problem. A cracked suspension spring, simple, repairable. When the clock finally began ticking again, Eleanor closed her eyes. For several seconds, she said nothing. Then she whispered, "That's what Sunday mornings used to sound like." She left, smiling. Helen quietly watched her walk away. "I don't think she came here because of the clock." Thomas nodded. "No. She came because someone remembered him." Word spread naturally after that. A retired dairy farmer arrived carrying his grandfather's pocket watch. A young couple brought a wedding clock inherited from an elderly aunt. An army veteran asked Thomas to restore a military travel clock that had crossed Europe with his father during World War II. Every repair became another conversation, another family story, another piece of history returning home. Helen gradually created a new tradition. Every visitor received a cup of tea before discussing repairs. She discovered people often needed someone willing to listen before they needed someone willing to fix something. Thomas admired how naturally she welcomed everyone. "You've turned my workshop into a living room," Helen laughed. "Good. People stay longer in living rooms." Shadow quickly became as famous as the clocks themselves. The old German shepherd greeted every customer with slow, gentle confidence. He never barked unnecessarily. Instead, he quietly walked beside newcomers before settling near their feet. Many older visitors instinctively reached down to stroke his graying muzzle while waiting. It calmed them. One Saturday afternoon, a young woman named Melissa Harper entered carrying the hand of her 8-year-old son. Melissa was in her early 30s with long chestnut hair tied into a simple ponytail, kind hazel eyes, and the tired expression of a mother who loved deeply but rarely rested. Years spent helping her son navigate the world had made her endlessly patient. The little boy beside her was Noah Harper. Noah was small for his age, with straight sandy blonde hair, pale skin lightly freckled across his nose, and large blue eyes that rarely met another person's gaze. Diagnosed with autism when he was 3, he found crowded places overwhelming and often communicated more comfortably through quiet routines than words. Melissa explained that loud noises frightened him. Almost immediately, Noah noticed Shadow. The old dog slowly approached. Instead of touching the boy first, Shadow simply sat, waiting. Noah hesitated, then carefully placed one small hand on the dog's thick neck. Shadow remained perfectly still. Within seconds, Noah smiled. Melissa covered her mouth. "I haven't seen him walk up to a stranger in months." Helen knelt beside the boy. He wasn't meeting a stranger. He was meeting another gentle soul. From that Saturday forward, Melissa and Noah visited almost every weekend. Sometimes they brought an old clock, sometimes they brought cookies. Most of the time they simply came so Noah could sit beside Shadow, listening to the steady ticking of the master regulator. The rhythm seemed to comfort him. One afternoon, Thomas noticed something remarkable. Noah was quietly counting. Tick, 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 perfectly matching the pendulum. Thomas smiled without interrupting. He hears balance. Later that evening, after the last customer had gone home, Helen locked the front door while the golden light of sunset filled the workshop. Shadow slept peacefully beneath the master regulator. Thomas looked around the room. Shelves, once covered in dust, now held clocks waiting patiently for repair. Fresh flowers brightened the windows. Laughter still seemed to linger in the air long after customers had left. He turned toward Helen. "When we bought this place, I thought we were saving a building." Helen slipped her hand into his. "We were. She looked around the warm, welcoming shop. It just turns out the building has been saving people too. The great regulator answered with its calm, steady rhythm. Tick, tick, tick. And for the first time since opening the door of Elijah Brooks's forgotten workshop, Thomas understood that restoring clocks had never been the true purpose of the place. It had always been about restoring the time people thought they had already lost. Autumn arrived in Bellows Falls, wrapped in crisp morning air and brilliant shades of red and gold. Maple leaves drifted quietly across Main Street, while the steady ticking from Elijah Brooks' Clockmaker's shop blended with the distant sound of the Connecticut River. The shop had become part of the town once again, and for the first time in decades, people measured their walks past the old building by the comforting rhythm coming through its open windows. Success, however, had a way of attracting attention from people who valued land more than legacy. One Tuesday afternoon, a polished black SUV stopped in front of the shop. A tall man stepped out wearing an expensive charcoal suit that seemed strangely out of place in the quiet Vermont town. His name was Victor Langford, 54 years old, president of Langford Development Group. He was broad-shouldered, clean-shaven, with carefully combed dark hair touched by grey at the temples. His confident smile had helped him negotiate multi-million-dollar projects across New England, yet years spent chasing profitable deals had slowly convinced him that every old building had a price. He was courteous rather than cruel, but he believed progress always required replacing the past. Victor entered the shop, pausing briefly to admire the master regulator clock. "I've heard remarkable things about this place," he said. Thomas looked up from a pocket watch resting beneath his magnifying loupe. "Then you've heard more than enough?" Victor laughed politely. "I hope you've also heard my company is redeveloping this block." Helen quietly placed 3 cups of tea on the table before sitting beside Thomas. Victor unfolded architectural drawings across the workbench: glass storefronts, restaurants, apartments, parking. "The location is perfect," he explained. "Your building sits at the center of everything." Thomas listened without interrupting. Finally, Victor slid a document across the table. "I'd like to purchase the property." Thomas glanced at the number. It was more money than he had imagined earning in the remainder of his life. Helen looked toward him but said nothing. Victor continued, "You've restored it beautifully. Now let us build something bigger." Thomas slowly folded the offer. "My wife and I didn't restore this shop to sell it." Victor smiled patiently. "Everyone has a number." Thomas looked toward the great regulator clock. "It already belonged to someone before it belonged to us." Victor gathered his papers. "If you change your mind, my offer stands." He left as politely as he had arrived. After the door closed, Helen reached for Thomas's hand. "Was it difficult?" He nodded honestly. "For about 3 seconds." They both laughed. Then Thomas returned to work. Unfortunately, he worked too much. The weeks that followed were busier than ever. Repairs filled every shelf. Letters arrived from neighboring counties. Thomas often skipped lunch without realizing it. Helen reminded him gently. He always answered, "Just one more clock." One rainy afternoon in late October, Thomas was adjusting the escapement on an 1890 Seth Thomas mantel clock when he suddenly stopped. The screwdriver slipped from his fingers. His face turned pale. One hand reached instinctively toward his chest. Helen looked up immediately. "Thomas?" He tried to answer. Instead, he sank slowly onto the workshop chair. Shadow was beside him before anyone else. The old German shepherd placed both front paws against Thomas's knee and let out a deep, anxious whine unlike anything Helen had heard before. "Stay with me," she whispered. Walter Briggs happened to be replacing a loose porch board outside and rushed inside at once. Within minutes, Reverend Daniel Moore called emergency services while Margaret Buckley closed the front door to keep worried customers outside. The ambulance arrived quickly. Dr. Emily Carter met them at Bellows Falls Medical Center. Emily was 46 years old with shoulder-length auburn hair tucked neatly behind one ear and thoughtful grey eyes that reflected years of emergency medicine. She spoke calmly even during difficult conversations, believing frightened patients deserved honesty, delivered gently. After several examinations, she returned carrying reassuring news. It was a mild heart attack. Helen closed her eyes with relief. He was fortunate. Emily looked directly at Thomas. Your heart isn't asking you to quit. It's asking you to slow down. Thomas smiled weakly. I've never been very good at slowing down. You'll learn. Recovery required several weeks. For the first time in decades, Thomas was forbidden to repair clocks. He hated it. Every morning he stared toward the workshop windows from the small bed at the back of the shop. Shadow refused to leave his side. The old dog lay beside the bed day and night, lifting his head each time Thomas moved, as though guarding not only his owner, but also the promise they had made to Elijah Brooks. Helen quietly assumed responsibilities she had never expected. She welcomed customers, recorded repair orders, watered flowers, prepared meals. Read Elijah's letter whenever discouragement threatened to overwhelm her. Soon something remarkable happened. The people Thomas had helped began returning. Walter organized volunteers to repaint the rear wall. Margaret sorted repair receipts. Reverend Daniel delivered hot dinners every Thursday evening. Eleanor Pierce spent afternoons polishing clock cases while sharing stories that made Helen laugh. Melissa and little Noah visited every Saturday. Noah carefully dusted empty shelves using a feather brush almost as tall as his arm. Each time he finished one shelf, Shadow wagged his tail as though approving the work. Then several local high school students appeared asking a surprising question. Would Mr. Walker teach us when he feels better? Helen smiled. I think he'd like that. Weeks later, Thomas slowly walked back into the workshop. Everyone stopped what they were doing. The great regulator continued ticking steadily. He looked around. Fresh paint covered the walls. Flowers bloomed outside. Clocks filled the shelves awaiting repair. Neighbors talked quietly over cups of tea. Young people cleaned workbenches without being asked. Thomas realized the shop had continued breathing even while he rested. Helen walked beside him. You see? He nodded. I thought I was rebuilding a workshop. She smiled. You were. But without noticing. It became a family, Thomas finished. The following Saturday morning, 4 young apprentices gathered around the oak workbench. Thomas placed Elijah Brooks's old tools carefully before them. No tuition, he said, no grades. Only one rule. The students listened closely. When you repair a clock, he rested one weathered hand gently upon the master regulator. Remember, you're never repairing metal. You're protecting someone's memories. The room became wonderfully quiet. Only one sound continued without interruption. Tick, tick, tick. And this time, every person inside the shop understood exactly what that sound truly meant. 5 springs had come and gone since Thomas and Helen Walker unlocked the weathered oak door of Elijah Brooks' Clockmaker's shop for the very first time. Every morning, sunlight poured through the restored front windows, painting long golden rectangles across the polished pine floor, while the Connecticut River shimmered beneath an endless blue Vermont sky. The shop no longer looked abandoned. It looked exactly as though it had always belonged there. The first sound each day was never conversation. It was the master regulator clock. Tick, tick, tick. Its steady rhythm had become as familiar to Bellows Falls as the church bell or the whistle of distant freight trains. Thomas was 77 now. His silver beard had grown a little whiter, and his movements had become slower after the heart attack years before, but his hands still possessed extraordinary precision. When he adjusted an escapement or polished a brass pivot, there remained a quiet confidence that only a lifetime of patient craftsmanship could produce. He no longer worked from sunrise until nightfall. Dr. Emily Carter's advice had become one promise he refused to break. Every afternoon he rested with a cup of tea before returning to his bench, believing that preserving himself was now part of preserving the shop. Helen, now 75, had become the heart of the building in ways even she never expected. Her silver-white hair had grown a little longer, usually tied loosely behind her neck with a blue ribbon. Fine lines surrounded her gentle eyes, but kindness seemed only to deepen with age. Visitors often said the warmth of the shop reached them before the warmth of the tea, though Thomas always insisted the opposite was true. Every flower box beneath the windows bloomed because of Helen. Every handwritten thank you note hanging near the front counter had been carefully preserved by her hands. Above Thomas's workbench hung Elijah Brooks's framed letter. Beside it rested an engraved brass plaque that simply read, "A clock keeps more than time. It keeps love alive." Visitors often stood quietly reading the letter before saying anything else. Many left with tears in their eyes. The first 4 apprentices had become skilled craftsmen in their own right. Andrew Collins, once a shy high school student, afraid of making mistakes, now repaired delicate pocket watches with remarkable confidence. Rachel Munro, whose curiosity had once filled every lesson with endless questions, had developed exceptional skill restoring antique grandfather clocks. David Morales specialized in marine clocks brought from old riverboats, while Grace Sullivan possessed an astonishing talent for engraving replacement brass components by hand. None of them had forgotten Thomas's first lesson. They repaired memories before machines. Saturday mornings remained sacred. Thomas taught. Helen welcomed guests. The apprentices worked quietly. Children sat listening to stories while Shadow watched from the doorway. Shadow had reached 16 years of age. His once powerful stride had become slow and careful. White fur now covered most of his muzzle, and his hearing had faded enough that Helen often needed to clap softly before calling his name. Arthritis stiffened his back legs during cold mornings, yet every sunrise he still struggled to stand, walked to the same place beside the front entrance, and lowered himself onto the old wooden porch exactly where he had chosen to rest on the very first day they arrived. Nobody ever occupied that place. It belonged to Shadow. Customers instinctively stepped around him with quiet respect. Children always greeted him before entering. One autumn afternoon, Noah Harper returned. He was 13 now, taller, more confident, and carrying a small wooden box beneath one arm. His sandy blonde hair had grown longer, and although he still preferred quiet spaces, he smiled more easily than he had as a frightened 8-year-old. Years of patient encouragement from his mother, Melissa, along with countless peaceful Saturdays spent inside the clock shop, had helped him find comfort in routines instead of fear. "I made something," Noah said. Inside the box lay a carefully carved wooden nameplate. The letters had been burned by hand. Shadow Thomas looked at the old dog. "I think someone has finally earned a proper sign." Andrew carefully mounted the nameplate beside Shadow's favorite place on the porch. From that day forward, every visitor knew who the elderly guardian was. Late one afternoon, after the final customer had left, Victor Langford returned. His expensive suits had become simpler over the years, and more grey appeared around his temples. He stood silently beneath the porch for a long moment before speaking. I drove by because I wanted to see whether I had been wrong. Thomas smiled. Were you? Victor looked around the busy workshop, the flowers, the apprentices, the families laughing over tea. Completely? He extended his hand. I'm glad you said no. Thomas shook it warmly. So am I. No contracts were discussed. None were needed. As the sun slowly disappeared beyond the hills, the apprentices locked the workshop and headed home. Helen carried 2 steaming mugs of tea onto the front porch. Thomas lowered himself carefully onto the old wooden bench beside her. Shadow slowly crossed the porch and rested his head across Thomas's worn leather boots, exactly as he had done hundreds of evenings before. The river carried the cool scent of approaching autumn. Leaves drifted quietly through the fading light. For a long while, no one spoke. Finally, Helen broke the silence. Do you remember the morning we left Burlington? Thomas nodded. I remember thinking we'd lost everything. Helen gently intertwined her fingers with his. And now? Thomas looked toward the glowing windows of Elijah Brooks' Clockmaker's shop. He listened to the steady heartbeat of the great regulator drifting into the evening air. He looked at the framed letter, at the flowers, at the porch, at Shadow sleeping peacefully between them. Then he smiled. I think time wasn't taking our home away. It was leading us here. Helen leaned her head gently against his shoulder. Neither of them needed another word. Inside the workshop, the master regulator continued its patient rhythm. Tick, tick, tick. The sound traveled through old timber, polished brass, warm laughter, faithful memories, and generations yet to come. The gold Elijah Brooks had hidden had saved a building. The craft Thomas had shared had saved a tradition. The kindness Helen had offered had saved lonely hearts, and the quiet loyalty of one aging German shepherd had reminded everyone who crossed that porch that the truest home is never built from wood or stone. It is built from the people who choose, day after day, never to leave one another behind. Sometimes God's miracles do not arrive as thunder from the sky, but as one small door opening after every other door has closed. Thomas, Helen, and Shadow remind us that when love stays faithful, even loss can become a path toward grace. May this story help you believe that God is still working quietly in ordinary lives. If it touched your heart, please share, comment where you are watching from, and subscribe for more stories. May God bless you and your family always,